a lot to do today. At my back, I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. It's the right quote for today. So, does someone have the time? What time? What? How do you know? The what? What clock? So if I were to read out stuff from my computer, would you believe it? You would? From my computer? I never advise you against that. So, do we agree with it? 9:40? Very nice. The conspiracy in the room, clearly. Okay, so 9:40, what does it mean? Silence. Well, but at 9:40, what does it mean? Surely, someone can tell me. You all get class begins, so that's what it is. So in fact, written in the great book of events is History of Information class starts, and we could use that instead of 9:40 as the time. All right, okay. Anyone else want to say 9:40? What are we saying when we say 9:40? What's the 9? 9 hours past midnight? How do we know? Because the moon. So you were out there last night. So what is the moon doing at midnight? Yeah, okay. So is it to do with the moon? What is that 9 hours telling? Okay, let's try another trick. The question. 4 hours from now, what will the time be? Sorry? We've got mathematicians in the room, clearly. Let me get my calculator out. 4 hours from now, it'll be? Okay, so we go from 9 to 1. So something happens in between. So is the day only 12 hours long? We start counting again? Sun? So noon, the sun is at its highest point. So that, in fact, is what we take the time from. So, in fact, it's not midnight, because we can't see anything out there, and actually the moon is somewhere over there. But it's midday that counts. And, in fact, that's deeply built into the way we talk about time. Probably a phrase that all of you use are, it's 9:30. Okay, what does AM stand for? Anti-meridian, thank you. And what's the alternative, Adam? Post-meridian, and what does that mean? Past the midpoint. Okay, so in fact, we seem to take time from the middle of the day, and yet we start counting all over again, which is kind of weird. Okay, the middle of the day, so the middle of the day, the sun is right overhead. Anybody checked? Anybody stood out there and said, I've got no shadow at noon? If you went out there at noon and checked, would you have no shadow? When it's 12 o'clock in Berkeley, and where else is it 12 o'clock? Yes? Everywhere. How far does our time zone extend? Yeah, well, it does. It's true, but it also extends east and west. So how far does it extend? Pacific time? So is the sun directly overhead in Arizona and Nevada and California all at the same time? So in fact, it isn't. We wouldn't expect it to be overhead. And indeed, until the 1880s, each of those places, and within each of those places, they had their own time, depending on where the time was directly overhead. So when we breezily say, with all due respect, Michael, it's 9:40, we're bringing in a huge number of assumptions that, well, maybe we're a little dodgy about. What about the day of the week? What's the day of the week is it? Can they tell me? That's always the question. Tuesday. And Tuesday is? Second day, yeah, especially, is it the second day or the third day of the week? Anyone got strong opinions? It's of course also, to a lot of people, a lot of other things. We might decide to call it Tuesday. I don't know why we call it Tuesday. You see, time and money was going to be the easy class. You were just going to Wall Street, you can handle time and money. You know why it's Tuesday? Kind of weird, actually. It's the German name for the god Mars, so it could also be called Mars Day, which of course is why the French call it Mardi. The Portuguese who don't go in for those gods anymore give it just a number. They give it the third day of the week. But they don't have the first day of the week for reasons we won't bother to get into. The month. So sometimes we can be. There's one thing if you go to Monticello, the Jefferson has his clock, and we all marvel at what Jefferson can build. But he has a clock that actually tells you what day of the week it is. So it tells you it's Tuesday, and you kind of feel that was somebody who either couldn't concentrate or drank too much every night if you had to be told in the morning what day of the week it is. But if you can't handle that, so what month is it? It's February. All right. It's actually a lot of things besides February, depending on where you are and who you are. And why is it called February? So we live with all this stuff. I'm trying to look at our computer and we read out the time and the date and we have no idea. Okay, well, in fact, when nobody's actually clear, people say February is probably of uncertain origin. Okay, the really hard question. What year are we in? The very last one. Okay, we got some doomsayers. There are some doomsayers in the assignments that we'll get to, but okay, that's a pretty gloomy answer. All right, the final bell has tolled. Okay, 2012. Are we agreed on that? Is the conspiracy still holding? We know there's a conspiracy about 9/40. Conspiracy about 2012? And what is 2012? When do we begin counting? And when did we begin counting? When? When, sorry? Okay, I mean, it's nicely put, sorry, you are? Karen, sorry, Karen. Yeah, we can put it nicely there, supposedly. Why did you say supposedly, in fact? That's interesting. Right, yeah, in fact, it wasn't, as we'll get to that, you're going to say? Well, you're getting there. It's involved in that. It actually wasn't either when they made the Julian or the Gregorian, but that's no fault to you. But it falls right about halfway in between the two when they suddenly decided we should have a baseline to start counting from. So, because it was the Christian West, they decided the baseline clearly is when Christ appears. And you say everything comes from before and everything after. But clearly, lots of people have other thoughts about it and when you should start counting from. And some think you can count from the beginning of the world, and others think from the beginning of a particular prophet's appearance or whatever. So, again, we've got a lot of arbitrary stuff going on where clearly dominant people come along and say, well, look, we're going to choose this. But all those choices kind of suddenly disappear, and we just take it and we can say, well, it's 9:40 on the 28th of February. And what's tomorrow's date going to be? And why is that strange? Is it a leap year? Okay, and we all know why the leap years? It's a quiet nodding here, right? I really hope somebody else will answer that question. Well, we'll get there. Okay, so what we're going to go through, just as it seemed we were making a steady progress, Jeff and Blake had brought us up happily into the 18th century, now we're going to be a little bit all over the map. Because these matters of time and money are obviously enormously significant to us now. I mean, Michael read the time out from his computer. Well, these computers wouldn't even begin to run if it wasn't for enormously complex synchronization of time within them. Money, too, drives our lives, and anyway, it drove many people out onto the street, and they stood in front of the stock exchange, where people had been reading out these prices as definitive prices. The stock of Microsoft is, the stock of Cisco is, but those numbers, too, start to look like pretty strange constructs when we stare them right in the face. So, we're going to try and look at this over history. Remember, we talked back at the very beginning of this question of whether time is linear or cyclical. And although for the most part we think of it as linear, and some people like Michael think we've come to the end of it, others may feel more close to the end of their cash than the end of time. But either way, in fact, we talk a little bit about when we talk about money, we talk about time often in cycles intervals rather than in linear form. So there's lots of ways in which these two are tied together. And in fact, in the assignment, many of you picking up from Thompson quoted the phrase, time is money. Who is famous for the first to say time is money? Figure we've met several times. Ben Franklin. And where does he say it? Anybody know? Now, Ben Franklin, so it's often seen as that American spirit of capitalism, everything has its price and go forward. Franklin says it. He said it actually in a book that you all know, that you all, of course, read cover to cover. Well, probably not. You just were asked to read one section of it. But in fact, this book, which is said to be by Fisher, the American edition was produced by Ben Franklin. And it was only noticed very recently that he'd actually added a piece to it in the back. So even in Thompson's time, it wasn't known where he wrote this. And in fact, he had added his advice to a young tradesman. And it's actually in the back of that book in which he says. And that book is an interesting and important book. But I also confess it was a tricky book to throw into the assignment, and I was where it was. Timothy makes a nice point that you should think, the first thing was to say, well, not just answer the question, but say, well, what kind of book is this? And he points out it's a primer. It was aimed to qualify any person for business without the help of a master. So it was a primer which you were meant to take home and learn for yourself. And did any of you actually feel, if you had reading the section about bookkeeping, that you now know how to do bookkeeping? I won't test you. All right, so the question of whether we can learn from it ourselves is tricky. And again, he very nicely points out that it nestles within, and he was wise enough to look at the title page, which tells you that there's reading and writing and arithmetic, composition of formal documents, instructions on how to undertake trades. In some ways, it reads like for somebody in the 18th century, a kind of history of information. It takes them through writing and drawing, in fact, and all the things that we've gone through. And the idea was that this was how someone in the colonies would be able to turn themselves into a businessman. In fact, this book was first published in London, and was as unpopular in England as it was in the States. And Franklin was probably, if we can say this, pirating the edition over here, so when we get to intellectual property, we should think about that again. Timothy takes me to task for actually setting that question and saying, can you tell from Fisher whether it's really plausible to argue that we're controlled by money? And I concede that point. It was a difficult assignment. In fact, most of you took Thompson's side. Thompson says that we're looking and saying it's simply commonplace, that something pretty profound happened with time. So that we've looked at all these technologies and these grand machines, and we've looked at all the stuff that's usually talked about when people think of an information revolution. But actually, time is something, and our sense of time is something pretty interesting to look at. And indeed, in the assignments, I think there were some interesting signs of how deeply time gets into our character, into our habitus. So Thompson says, look, it's commonplace that between 1300 and 1650 in intellectual culture of Western Europe, so let's keep it to us, important changes in the apprehension of time. So that's time. People think time did do something pretty significant to us. And money. Well, again, if you look at the great German intellectual theorists of the early 20th century, Weber and Sombart, they both saw accounting, which we worked on, as really, really significant in the shaping of the Western intellectual mind. In an unfair summary of Weber, basically he sees in bookkeeping, in rational accounting, the beginning of this system of rationalism, which in the end puts us all into the iron cage of bureaucracy. So he sees in that stuff in Fisher, which looks kind of so weird and so old-fashioned and distant, something that is still with us today, and I'm going to argue that it is. Sombart, too, saw it as a complete depersonalization of human relations as we went to accounting. And some of you made this point nicely in the assignment, that once we start putting things down in numbers, somehow we lose both contact and control with them. And even this book came out this year, and probably hard to see, but it says double entry, so it's just what you were reading about, how the merchants of Venice shaped the modern world, and how the invention could make or break the planet. So Janet Gleason White is again saying this is one of the really profound changes. So leave the printing press aside in some ways. This is something that had a real change. And again, a little like Michael, she thinks it might be going to bring the end of the planet too. So she's gloomy as well. Right, so you've got these people paying, well, again, this chap, did I bring his book, Alfred Cosby, in a way raises the stakes and much more in a very nice book called The Measure of Reality. And he narrows it down to 50 years. And he says, between 1275 and 1325, Europe's first mechanical clock and canon, marine charts, perspective painting, and double entry bookkeeping. There are decades unmatched in the radical changes in perception until the era of Einstein. In the past 7 centuries, he goes on to say later, bookkeeping has done more to change the perception of more bright minds than any single innovation in innovation or philosophy. So he's making pretty big claims that this, leave printing aside, leave the telegraph aside. These are the things that really did change the way in which we see the world. And in fact, part of Crosby's argument is because Western Europe became obsessed with numbers and counting and accounting and time, and that connection between time and money, that's part of why they became such an enormously significant economic and military power. Marx in Capital has a nice bit where he talks about Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. And Crusoe, when he's on the island, manages to rescue from the ship before it sinks a stock book so he can do his accounting, and a clock so he knows what the time is. And Marx says this is just the sign. This is emblematic in a way of Western man, that he cannot think anymore without these two objects that dominate his thought. So those two, time, Robinson Crusoe's clock, and the stock book and his ledger in which he does accounting, and Crusoe endlessly does accounting on the island, lead to all sorts of things. In one account, it's why he dominates the person that he meets on the island, whose name is Man Friday. Well, surprise, surprise, so he gives him the name of the day of the week. And that in some sense is emblematic of Western dominance over other people. Okay, so if I can possibly do it in the time allotted, and I doubt I can, this is what I want to try and talk us through today. First, I want to talk about what I call fighting time. That is, while we can say fairly easily that it's 9:40, well, until you meet a pain in the neck like me who says, why and what do you mean? But normally you can just say 9:40 and get away with it. In fact, establishing the time and the date are enormous battles that not only have a long and consequential history, so we referred to the Julian and the Gregorian calendar, and we'll talk about those, but in fact we still fight about today, and we're still going on with. One of the things then, as we go through this, and I'll be jumping all over the place and probably won't get to the end, but I want to kind of bear in mind the kind of two views of this, that Newton has this wonderful, highly scientific idea of absolute time. The time is simply there, and we follow it and we record it, and it's this sort of objective thing in the world, absolute, true, and mathematical time. But there was a nice answer in the assignment. Elizabeth Lanning, is she here? Elizabeth, yeah, I thought you gave a very nice answer in which you said, I guess you had difficulty remembering your answers, I'll help you with this one. But I thought what you said was very nice, and I don't mean you personally have difficulties, so whenever we ask anyone what they wrote in the assignment, they go. But you said, look, that we actually, our sense of time was reconstructed, and we now let it sort of come back and haunt us and construct us. But what you pointed out, and several of you did in this, is that once you start reading Thompson, you think, well, time seems to be a sort of artificial construct in some way, and yet we end up being run by it. So on the one hand, we have these very significant sort of informational markers like time and money, but when we stare them in the face, they don't look quite as stable as they do as when we just let them run us and run our lives. And indeed, the idea that time is in any way absolute is constantly belied, and this is actually a good year when the last year or so. We talked about the time zone. Russia last year just decided to drop 2 time zones off the map. So there were all these Russians who, just like you, at midday rush out and make sure the sun is overhead, and somebody took the sun away. It just wasn't there anymore. It was way over the horizon almost. So we're rather arbitrary in our way about time, is that they just thought there were too many time zones. And they just told people, now in fact, as with European currency, where the French have only just got rid of the franc, getting people to get rid of these things, as with metric units, which America was meant to accept in the 1970s and still hasn't, getting people to accept these things can be pretty tricky. And indeed, you can see people who dither about it. Samoa and Tuvalu, they decided that they didn't want to have a 30th of December this year. So they just decided to swap time zones, rush to New Year. They thought they had their New Year party early. They in fact just moved out of one time zone because they live near the international date line. They just decided to hop over the other side of it. Instead of it running around them that way, they had it run around them that way. Not only did they decide to do that, they decided to do that because they do a lot of their trade with Australia, and it's much more convenient to be on the same date as Australians. But in fact, a little while back, they'd done the swap in the other direction because they thought they wanted to do most of their trading with America, and it'd be better to be in the same time zone as Hawaii. So again, there's a sort of arbitrariness. When you ask someone what's the date, and they say, oh, well, yesterday it was 2011, and today, well, it might be 2000, maybe it's 2000, I can't remember. You find that a little strange, and yet people will do that. Now, these seem to be very broad brush decisions, far away from those little scientific questions where we have that Newtonian precision. Don't for a minute believe it. In fact, in January of this year, the big crucial question for science over time was about the leap second. And here we have it significantly cited. It's how our machines run. It's how the world clocks the time. So everybody gets together in January to have this big decision. The United Nations calls its organization, what are we going to do about the leap time? Everybody holds their breath, and nothing happens. They couldn't make up their mind, because in fact the Americans want to get rid of the leap second, and the Europeans want to keep the leap second, and nobody is able to agree. So they said, well, we'll decide a little later down the road. So in fact nobody really knows what the time is, because the people who are meant to tell us and tell our machines haven't made up their own mind. So again, this stuff that looks very scientific and stable, when we think about it, sort of wobbles a bit if we look very close. And in fact that's true in cash. I mean, one of the nice, interesting things that's come along is just from the week's paper, MF Global, some of you will probably have heard about it, former governor of New Jersey, former member of Goldman Sachs. John Corzine funds a company after he leaves office. Company goes gangbusters for a while and then crashes and goes bankrupt. And it looks as though their accounts are in complete disarray. So then the whole of the Fed move in there to audit their books and say, what have they been doing with their clients' money? Well, they've been at it for 3 months, and they have to admit there's $325 million. They have no idea where it is, where it came from, whose money it was, and where it went. And suddenly, all these figures you get on Wall Street that seem so reliable, it's taken 3 months, and they still can't work out where that transfer is. So, if they can't do it, no wonder you can't balance your checkbooks if you even try. So, these things are in some way to throw a light on where we think we have robust information and figures and numbers and values that we can agree on, but they do all sorts of tricky things. One more thing, just to note about the particular period we're going to be looking at, that period of Fisher's book, the period, for the most part, which Thompson talks about, the beginning of industrial capitalism. A couple of assignments made these comments in passing. Kevin, are you here? Kevin, hi, and Mary? Okay, so they said, just in passing, Fisher describes many different kinds of journals and books used to record exchanges and information. And Mary said, Fisher is more convincing this because I think the organization detail of a ledger day book is set up and it leads to a very clear and helpful collection of information. Anyone knows anything significant about those quotations? I suspect most of you dodged the reading, which would make this significant. But anybody look at the keeping a day book? Anyone notice anything about that first sentence in there? Actually, in the primary documents, with one exception that I mentioned, in the primary documents, this is probably the first time we come upon the actual use of the word information. And all those other things, in all the sprats, you don't find it. It's a word that comes into use in sort of the ways that we begin to use it now, though not entirely, at this time. And that kind of innocent use that we both saw in Mary and Kevin's work, but also, hey, look, this stuff is information, probably just begins to be talked about there. We met it in one other place, in an original document, just in passing. Does anyone remember where? When we talked very briefly about the State of the Union, I mentioned that it's the one place in the Constitution in which information is made. You shall from time to time give information about the President. Okay, so I'm still not actually at the beginning of what I'm trying to do, so let me try to get there. Okay, so we talked a little about calendars. One of the tricky things about trying to get the year right is, how long does a year? Sorry? 365 days. Sorry, you are? Stephanie, 365 days. Any advance on 365? Any advance on 365? Anyone going ahead? And you are? Kalina? 365 and a quarter. I have 365 and a quarter. Any advance on 365 and a quarter? Yes. We're getting to the moon. Well, how long is 12 cycles of the moon? And is it in fact 12 cycles of the moon? It's 13. But the lunar months and solar months are tricky things to deal with. Okay, 365 and a quarter. Anybody going to give a bit on that? That's actually the trouble. It isn't exactly 365, and it isn't exactly 365 and a quarter. And because of little wobbles and things, it isn't exactly predictable. Now, for most of us, that makes no problem, because we think of it as Stephanie says, as 365 and a quarter. 365, sorry, what were you bidding? I can't remember. 65. Yeah. For most of us, that's fine, and then Colleen comes along and reminds us actually the little extra. So we build in this leap year every 4 years. Well, if you don't build the leap year in every 4 years, your calendar starts to get out of whack relatively quickly, so that you're a day out when you try to predict the future. When you think the next equinox will be, if you go from equinox to equinox, it won't be on the date you predict if you get the number of days wrong. So there's a lot of if you begin with a rough approximation, and of course if on the 365th day the sun isn't out, then you can't tell whether it's right overhead and if you've got the right time. So they always had trouble messing around with the calendar, and they had to work out whether it was going to be lunar months, as Adam suggested, of which there are 13, because they're only 4 weeks long, or whether it's solar months, of which there are 12, and then how many days you have in a month, and then how many months you have in the year. That's arbitrary in a way. So in fact, the Romans, who took a lot of their timekeeping from the Egyptians, but also with some debt to the Sumerians,